Hi, everybody. This is Pastor Tim Mattison from Bainbridge First Baptist Church, Bainbridge Island, Washington. It was a blessing to finally be back in our sanctuary for the morning service that we had today. And when you're ready, if you weren't there with us, I hope you'll join us and be a part of the church family there once again. And not ready yet, that's fine. Take your time, and when you're ready, we'll look forward to seeing you there. I'd like to share with you a message this evening that's, I think, appropriate for the age we live in and for the times that we're a part of right now. It's from a very familiar passage of Scripture, at least I hope it is to you. I know every time I teach it, it just seems to be more special to me, and I hope that every time you hear it, you'll gain something else out of it as we look at it. It's from Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 to 32 this afternoon. You know, one of the difficulties that our soldiers have sometimes in the conflict in Afghanistan is that friends um, may look like enemies, and enemies may look like friends. Um, it's that way with God sometimes. You know, when we first come to Christ, um, sometimes we have our own ideas about what being a Christian is going to be like and what God is like. And then we discover as time goes on that, God shows up in some ways that I didn't expect. And God does some things that I didn't expect from God. The truth is that God is an infinite being who can't be limited by our own ideas about what he should be like. In fact, he often appears in disguise in a way. And that's what comes out of this story I want to share with you this afternoon. And the title of this message gives it away. It's just surprise, it's God. I'd like you to be watching for God to appear in your own life, maybe in some unlikely ways, and maybe in ways that you never thought um, God should act or appear. There are three surprises that come out of this passage that I want to call to your attention this afternoon. Number one, God may appear as an enemy. Now, if you have Genesis 32 in front of you, let me begin in verse 22 to 24. It says, he rose up that night, and he took his two wives and his two women servants and his 11 sons and passed over the ford Jabbok. And he took them and sent them over the brook and sent over all that he had. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. Uh, Genesis 32 is where Jacob has left his 20 years that he had spent in Mesopotamia, and he's on his way back to the land of Canaan, where his family was and where he started many years ago. And as he begins to enter the land, uh, he's a little worried about his brother Esau, because the last time he saw his brother Esau was trying to kill him. And he was determined that as soon as dad dies, I'm going to kill my brother. He was so angry with him. And so he sent a message to Esau, and also sent a present with a number of his servants, very generous, as a way to ease his entry back into the land of Canaan. And then his servants went, delivered the message, the original party, and came back and said, well, Esau is coming to you with 400 men with him. And that was a little problematic for Jacob. I think he was a little concerned. But we see him there by the river Jabbok, and he's alone. Now, his family had already crossed over that day. This river, it was not a major barrier. The Jabbok is about 30 feet wide and maybe hip deep on most people. You could probably cross over in a minute if you were by yourself, but it was no doubt an all-day job for Jacob to get all of the sheep and the cattle and the camels and the cows and the women and children and servants across. And you can imagine what that might be like, trying to get everybody organized, especially when you're dealing with animals. Maybe some animals wouldn't think on anything about it. They just splash across and go on to the other side. And other animals, when that first hoof hits the water, they turn around and run in the opposite direction, and then they have to be rounded up again. And so yeah, I'm sure it was quite a job to get this whole mass of um, animals and children and servants and his wives across. And probably he stayed behind on the opposite side as a good farmer, just to make sure there wasn't any strays that he needed to take care of that were left behind, that didn't make the crossing. And you can picture what it was like that night. He rose up that night and crossed over, and Jacob was left alone. And there wrestled with him a man. Can you see him in the nighttime? It's dark. He's in a strange place when all of a sudden he realized he's not alone. There's somebody else out there. And next thing you know, a man jumps on him and wrestles with him. I want to ask you, what do you think that was that Jacob was thinking? That could be wrestling with him in the middle of the night. I bet he thought at first, that's got to be Esau. He's found me, and finally he's come to get me. They wrestled, and then they wrestled and wrestled until the breaking of the day. If it was a boxing match, I guess Jacob could run away if he wanted to, or try to fight back. But if a man jumps on you and wrestles you to the ground, uh, you don't have a lot of choice but to wrestle back. And that's the situation that Jacob found himself in there. It had to be when he was alone. You know, Jacob over the years had built up layers of protection, his family and his wealth and his cattle and his servants that occupied his time and his thoughts, just like many of us so many times. But at some point during the night, he realized that, wait a minute, this isn't just a man. It's not Esau, my enemy. It's not even a criminal. Hosea 12:3 and 4 describes that same experience. It says, in his strength, he struggled with God. Yes, he struggled with the angel and prevailed. Now, God started it. He jumped on Jacob. He appeared as an enemy. But, you know, this was also an indication of God's grace that he was about to offer Jacob. I mean, really, God wrestling with a human being? Does an elephant wrestle with a mouse? Previously, Esau had been the enemy, and now it was God who was the opponent. In Jacob's life, you know, he's like a lot of us. This was not some new thing, but it was a sample of a battle that had been going on all his life. He was constantly fighting for what God promised him in the first place. Even before they were born, God said, the elder shall serve the younger. He didn't have to work for that, and he didn't have to struggle. He didn't have to go through the lies and the deception that he went through to gain power over Esau. God said it would happen. But God had to appear as an enemy to bring Jacob to a place where he would yield. I'm told when trying to rescue a drowning person to wait. There have been 2 times in my life where I had to rescue someone who was drowning, but I'm not a lifeguard. I'm certainly no expert. But I have been told by lifeguards that, uh, first of all, if it's possible, stay out of the water with a person who's drowning. Throw him a rope or even a branch or a life preserver. Stay out of the water. But if you actually have to get in the water with someone who's drowning, you need to wait until he stops struggling and even just swim circles around him. You see, you can't save a person who's trying to save himself. He'll latch on to you, and you'll both go down if he's in that situation. And sometimes God has to bring us to the place where we're ready to stop with the struggle. I don't know about you, but I've discovered many times that my toughest battles have not been with the devil, they've been with God. I found it's easier to say no to the devil than to say yes to God. Sometimes we're frustrated because there are things in our life that just seems to be undone, and we may, even as pastors, be frustrated with the way things are going in the congregation and in the church. Let's be honest, there's a little Jacob in all of us. You ever wrestled with God? Maybe it's time. God may show up like an enemy, but he's not an enemy. It's his grace. And when he does, let him take control and wrestle you to the ground. The second surprise that comes out of this story is in verses 25 and 26, and that is God may be the source of your pain. Verse 25, it says, when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. Now, isn't that interesting? God is wrestling with Jacob, and it says he did not prevail against him. You know what? I think that fight was fixed. And this is another indication of God's grace. God would not use more force than Jacob could stand. And Jacob was touched by God. He touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh, and it was out of joint as he wrestled with him. This is not a trick wrestling move. It's not a hard blow. And all God has to do is just a touch. He could do that with a finger. He could have prevailed if he wanted to, of course. But that's the thing. He didn't want to. He's telling Jacob, let me go. And he's really thinking, I hope he doesn't. God could have walked away from that wrestling match anytime he wanted. And at this point, of course, by the time that the day was breaking, they'd been wrestling all night long. Jacob is exhausted. Have you ever tried to wrestle for 10 minutes? He's exhausted, and he's not even wrestling anymore. He's just clinging. That's all he can do to God. I will not let you go unless you bless me. You know, this is similar to other encounters that people have had with God. You'll read about in the Bible. When Jesus was on the road to Emmaus after his resurrection, and he was talking with the 2 disciples, and it says he made as though he would go further. And you know what? He would have gone further, but they invited him to come and be with him. When the disciples were in their boat on the lake in the middle of a storm, in the middle of the night, he appeared as though he would have passed by. And he would have passed by unless they wanted him to stay and to come. And he would not let go. He finally recognized his opponent as God and also recognized his own inability. He can't out wrestle God. He can't fight God anymore. And all he can do is cling to him. And that's where Jacob found himself there. You see, he did not need to wrestle with God because God is stingy, but because he needed changing. God may change you before he'll bless you. We have a tendency to assume that nothing good can come from our pain. The Apostle Paul, when he describes the abundance of revelations that he was given by God in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, says, along with the abundance of all the revelations, he was given a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan. Now, I find that interesting. God gave him a thorn in the flesh, and that thorn in the flesh was a messenger of Satan. So which was it? A gift from God or an attack by Satan? Well, the truth is, it was both. Satan was trying to destroy Paul. God was trying to make him even more usable, and they were both using the same tool, the pain that they experienced from that thorn in the flesh that he had. So don't assume that no good can come from your pain. In fact, if you're a child of God, he doesn't allow it in your life unless it'll do something good. One of the things I've learned over the years is that so often pain and blessing show up at the same time, and they're tied together. Because sometimes God has to change us before he can bless us. So many of the Psalms begin with tragedy and end up with praise for the same experience. In Psalm 3, for example, the first verse in that psalm is, Lord, how have they increased who trouble me? Many are they who rise up against me. But when you get to the end of that psalm, the last verse, salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people. Remember, many years ago, there was a television program. It was called Touched by an Angel. I don't know if you saw that or not, but it was about an angel who would go around and minister to people from time to time and from place to place. And people would complain to the angel. I think her name was Monica, about the situation that they were in. And it was just the normal situations of life. You know, why did God let me lose my job? Why did the baby die? And why would God put me through that? Of course, the answer of the angel was always, God would never do that. He loves you. Well, God does love you. In fact, he loves you enough to bring pain into your life in order to bless you. When pain arrives, look for the blessing that's coming if you're a child for God, because often pain and blessing arrive at about the same time. And the third surprise that we see here is God may change you before he'll bless you. First of all, God may appear as an enemy. Secondly, God may be the source of your pain, and God may change you before he'll bless you. In verse 27, we read that he said unto him, what is thy name? And he said, Jacob. Boy, it's kind of surprising, isn't it, that God didn't know his name? Doesn't God know everything? And he has to ask Jacob, what is thy name? He knew his name, of course. You think God was just wandering through the land of Canaan and decided to mug a tourist? Didn't even know who he was? You see, God was not looking for information. He was looking for a confession. The name Jacob was given to him when he was born. That kind of describes the nature of this man. The name Jacob means heel grabber. He's the supplanter. He was a cheat. He's the con man, the liar. And this also takes him back to the point of departure. You see, when he left his father in the land of Canaan years and years before, and it's in chapter 27, verse 19 of Genesis. His father was blind, and he stood before his blind father, and he uttered those words, I am Esau, and cheated his brother out of the blessing that he intended to give to Esau. What's your name? Uh, I think God wanted to hear him say that. And he said, Jacob. And he said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. His name was now going to be Israel. He fought with God. Was he really different? I'll tell you one thing, he never again went back to fraud and deceit. He struggled with God, had power with God, and prevailed. Esau would not be a problem for him. God will take care of Esau, and he did. They patched up their differences. And of course, he wanted to know. In verse 29, Jacob asked him and said, tell me, I pray thee thy name. And he said, wherefore is it that thou ask after my name? And he blessed him there. Why is it you ask my name? You already know who I am, in other words. You don't have to ask. And that's why he named that place. In verse 30, Peniel, Jacob called the name of that place Peniel. Peniel means the face of God, for I've seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And as he passed over Peniel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. He met God as an adversary, and he left his friends. He'd seen God face to face and lived. And now we see him limping on that thigh. He would never take another step for the rest of his life without a limp. It's a permanent sign of his struggle and his own inability as he met with God. You ever imagine what it would be like to be blessed by God? Jacob was probably far from that picture as he made his way across the river as the sun came up that morning, and maybe Rachel was just coming out of her tent there, looked across the river, and here comes Jacob. Been wrestling all night, scratched, and maybe he was still bleeding. His clothes were torn, dirty, a few twigs in his hair, limping badly, and probably his wife would say, what happened to you? And he would have to say, Rachel, I've been blessed. You may think to yourself, it doesn't look like any victorious Christian I ever saw. But, they really don't. I think you'll find some of the people who walk the most closely with God walk with a limp because he's touched them in some way. Jacob changed in two ways. He received a new name. He could never rely on that bad leg again. And that was God's way of separating the old Jacob from the new Jacob. And he changed in terms of his relationships with other people. I've heard a lot of people say that grace means that God doesn't care what we are. The truth about grace, and we can go back to the sermon that Brother Weimer preached this morning, is that God accepts us as we are, like Jacob even, um, a con man, a liar, a cheat, and then changes us into the image, likeness of Christ. As we think about this great story, it may be that you've been praying, Lord, bless me, when you should be praying, Lord, make me someone you can bless. Lord, use me, when maybe we should be praying, Lord, make me usable. God may appear as an enemy when he shows up in your life. God may be the cause of your pain. And God may change you before he'll bless you. At Bethel, he began his walk with God. And this was when it became even more real. At Bethel, he saw a ladder going up to heaven. At the river Jabbok, he saw the Lord. At Bethel, he became a believing man. And here he became a broken man. At Bethel, he became a son of God. And here he became a saint of God. He came away from Bethel with a new spring in his step. And he came away from the river Jabbok with a lasting limp in his walk. At Bethel, to a certain extent, he died to sin, but here he died to self. It may be that you're going through a time in your life right now where God seems distant and he may be a part of your life, not at all. And it could be that he's been there all the time, though, in disguise. Let God wrestle with you. When you have the chance, embrace it. Well, hope you have a great day, and I look forward to our next chat together on Wednesday. We'll see you then.